There is a stage of psychological evolution so advanced that reaching it quietly turns you into a target. You did not ask for this. You did not seek conflict. You simply kept refining yourself, kept observing, kept choosing depth over noise, and somewhere along that long, lonely path, you crossed an invisible threshold. And the moment you crossed it, the people around you began to react to you in ways that made no rational sense. You were kind, and they grew colder. You were honest, and they grew suspicious. You stayed silent, and somehow your silence offended them, more than any word ever could. You have spent years wondering what is wrong with you. Tonight, you will finally understand that nothing is wrong with you. Something is right with you. And that is precisely the problem they cannot tolerate. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You are not difficult. You have simply reached the stage Carl Jung called Sophia, and the people who hate you are not hating you at all. They are reacting to a reflection they cannot bear to see. By the end of this, you will never again misread their hostility, and you will never again carry the weight of a confession that was never yours to hold. Read those words again, slowly, because hidden inside them is the entire architecture of every strange, unprovoked hostility you have ever experienced. The people who treat you badly are not responding to you. They are running from themselves, and you happen to be standing in the path of their escape. You were taught that if you were kind enough, patient enough, generous enough, accommodating enough, the world would meet you with the same softness you offered it. That teaching was not a moral truth. It was a social instruction designed for people who had not yet developed the perception to see what was actually happening around them. And the system that taught you this needed you to keep believing it, because a Sophia Empath who understands the real game becomes ungovernable, unmarketable, and impossible to exploit. Your kindness was never the problem. Your kindness without clarity was the vulnerability. And the moment your clarity caught up to your kindness, the entire social field around you shifted, because suddenly you were no longer an energy source that could be drained quietly. You became a mirror, and most people would rather destroy a mirror than look into it. There is one specific thing that happens inside an unintegrated mind the instant it encounters a Sophia Empath, and once you understand it, you will never again take their hostility personally. But before we reach that revelation, you have to see the road that brought you here, because the road itself is the proof of who you have become. If these ideas resonate with you, hit that subscribe button for more top-tier content. Also, drop a sovereign mirror in the comments so I know you're ready. Let's dive in. Every Sophia Empath begins as something else entirely. You did not arrive at clarity. You bled your way into it. For most of your life, you operated in what Carl Jung psychology identifies as the wounded healer stage, the early architecture of an empath who feels too much and understands too little of what they are feeling. In this stage, your gift was indistinguishable from your wound. You absorbed the emotional residue of every room you entered. You took on responsibilities that were not yours. You apologized for tension you did not create. You explained yourself to people who had already decided not to understand you. And the moment someone showed even the faintest sign of pain, your nervous system would override your own needs and rush toward them, because somewhere inside you, you had been trained to believe that your worth was measured by your usefulness to people in distress. That is not generosity, that is conditioning. And the dark psychology of the world we live in feeds on exactly this kind of conditioning, because a person whose self-worth depends on being needed will never set a boundary that costs them connection. You may have called yourself an empath, but at that stage, you were closer to an emotional sponge. There is a precise, almost humiliating sensation that lives inside the wounded healer stage, and you have felt it many times. It is the moment you walk away from a conversation where you gave everything, listened deeply, offered insight that took you years to earn, and realize as you drive home that the other person never once asked how you were. And worse, they will call you again next week and you will pick up. That specific exhaustion is the signature of the wounded healer, and most empaths die inside that stage without ever leaving it. But something inside you began to refuse. You started to notice patterns. You started to track who took and never returned. You started to feel the cost of your own generosity in your body before your mind could rationalize it away. That noticing was the first crack in the conditioning. That noticing was the beginning of your individuation. And once individuation begins, it cannot be reversed, only resisted at greater and greater psychological cost. The empath awakening does not feel like enlightenment in the beginning. It feels like grief, because you have to mourn every version of yourself that traded clarity for approval. You have to bury the part of you that believed if you just loved people correctly, they would love you back. And in the silence after that burial, something else begins to grow. Something colder, something quieter, something that does not flinch. That something is the seed of Sophia, and the people in your life are about to notice it long before you do. There is a law inside Carl Jung's psychology, so precise it functions almost like physics, and once you internalize it, the behavior of every difficult person in your life becomes mathematically predictable. Jung called it projection. But that word has been so diluted by casual use that its true weight has been lost. Projection is not simply blaming others for your own faults. Projection is the involuntary, unconscious expulsion of every part of the self that a person refuses to integrate. Every quality they have buried, denied, suppressed, or shamed into silence gets ejected outward. And then they perceive that quality as belonging to someone else, usually someone who triggers them for reasons they cannot articulate. This is the shadow projection mechanism, and it is the reason your kindness provokes hostility in certain people. They are not seeing you. They are seeing the disowned parts of themselves that your presence makes visible. Consider what happens when a person who has spent decades suppressing their own depth encounters someone who lives openly in theirs. Consider what happens when a person who has betrayed their own intelligence to fit in encounters someone whose intelligence remains intact. Consider what happens when a person who has abandoned their own sensitivity to survive encounters someone who has refined theirs into wisdom. In each case, your existence becomes an unbearable accusation, even though you have made no accusation at all. You are simply standing there, being what they could have been. And the unintegrated psyche has only two ways to resolve that tension. It can do the brutal work of facing itself, which most people will never do, or it can attack the mirror. Attacking the mirror is cheaper, faster, and emotionally satisfying in the short term. That is why they choose it. That is why you have been chosen. There is a specific, very particular feeling you have had many times that you have never been able to name correctly. It is the feeling of walking into a room and sensing, before anyone has spoken, that you have already been judged. It is the feeling of being disliked by someone you have never wronged. It is the feeling of watching a person's face tighten the moment you enter, for reasons neither of you will ever discuss out loud. That feeling is not paranoia. That feeling is shadow projection registering in your nervous system before your conscious mind has caught up. Your body has been reading the data for years. You just did not have the framework to decode it. And here is the part that will reorganize everything you thought you understood. The people who project onto you most aggressively are not your enemies. They are your confessions. Every accusation they make is an autobiography. When they call you cold, they are confessing their inability to regulate their own warmth. When they call you arrogant, they are confessing the inferiority they cannot metabolize. When they call you manipulative, they are revealing the strategies they themselves run unconsciously. Jung's law of projection is this: we accuse others of the exact sins we are secretly committing or secretly desiring to commit. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. And once you stop taking their accusations personally, something begins to shift in the social field around you that they can feel but cannot name. They begin to sense that their projections are no longer landing, and that is the precise moment their hostility intensifies, because the mirror is no longer absorbing. The mirror is reflecting back. But there is something even more disturbing happening underneath their hatred, something the average empath never sees, and understanding it is what separates the wounded healer from the Sophia. We will reach that floor of the basement together, but only after you understand what they are actually defending against when they react to you this way. When a person who runs on manipulation, performance, or controlled image encounters someone who cannot be moved by any of those tools, something happens inside them that clinical observers have called the narcissistic collapse. It does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a sudden coldness. Sometimes it looks like a smear campaign that begins out of nowhere. Sometimes it looks like a family member who used to merely dislike you, now seeming to actively organize against you. What you are witnessing is not random cruelty. You are witnessing the structural failure of a personality that depended on being able to read, predict, and control the emotional responses of the people around it. And you, the Sophia Empath, have become unreadable. Think carefully about what social power actually requires for most people. It requires that the people around them respond predictably to flattery, to subtle put-downs, to guilt, to silence, to charm, to selective affection. The entire toolkit of dark psychology, whether wielded consciously by skilled manipulators or unconsciously by emotionally immature people, depends on the target having an open, reactive nervous system. The wounded healer empath has exactly that. The Sophia Empath does not. And when the manipulator runs their familiar play and gets nothing back, no flinch, no defensiveness, no eager explanation, no anxious repair attempt, just calm, clinical observation, something inside them begins to panic in a way they cannot consciously process. They do not understand that they are panicking. They only know that being around you produces an unbearable internal pressure, and rather than examine that pressure, they assign it to you. You become the cause of their discomfort, even though all you did was stop participating in the choreography. There is a sentence you have probably heard about yourself, spoken behind your back or whispered carelessly within earshot. Something like, "There is just something about her," or "I cannot put my finger on it, but he rubs me the wrong way." Notice how vague those statements are. Notice how they never actually identify a behavior or a wrong. That vagueness is not laziness. That vagueness is the linguistic signature of a projection that cannot find a real target. They are trying to articulate the discomfort of being in the presence of someone whose mind they cannot enter, and they have no vocabulary for that experience, so they reach for the language of social dismissal instead. Here is the precise moment you have been living through without recognizing it. When a manipulator realizes they cannot control you, they do not retreat. They escalate, because escalation is the last tool in the kit. They will test you with provocation, with withdrawal, with triangulation, with sudden warmth followed by sudden coldness, with rumors, with subtle exclusion. Each tactic is a question disguised as an attack, and the question is always the same. Can I still move you? The Sophia Empath answers that question with stillness, and stillness is the one response the manipulator has no counter for. This is not strategic detachment performed as a technique. This is strategic detachment as an emergent property of integration. You do not have to try to be unmoved. You simply no longer have the internal hook for them to grab. And as you sit in that stillness, watching them escalate, something almost clinical begins to happen inside you. You start to see their behavior as data. You start to notice the precise sequence of their moves. You start to understand that you have been observing a very predictable pattern that simply used to feel like chaos, because you were inside it instead of above it. That elevation from participant to observer is the second great threshold of empath awakening, and once you cross it, there is no version of you that can pretend not to know. But there is a deeper layer to all of this, a layer that recontextualizes everything we have discussed so far, and reaching it requires you to confront something about yourself that you have probably been avoiding. Here is where the work turns inward, and where most people would prefer the video to end, because what comes next is uncomfortable in the exact way that growth is uncomfortable. You have been told correctly that the hatred directed at you is a confession from the other person. That is true. But the deeper truth, the one that separates Sophia from every earlier stage, is that until you fully integrate your own shadow, you are also confessing things you do not realize you are confessing. The empath who is still secretly hoping to be understood by people who have proven they cannot understand them is confessing a residual need for external validation. The empath who still rehearses imaginary conversations with the people who hurt them is confessing an unresolved attachment to being seen as innocent. The empath who quietly enjoys feeling morally superior to the people who reject them is confessing a shadow investment in the role of misunderstood saint. None of this makes you bad. All of it makes you human. And acknowledging it is the only doorway into actual sovereignty, because everything you refuse to see in yourself becomes the lever that other people unconsciously use to move you. This is the law beneath the law. The reason their projections occasionally still land, even now, even after all your work, is because there is still some small, unintegrated piece inside you that resonates with the accusation. The Sophia Empath does not become invulnerable by armoring up. The Sophia Empath becomes invulnerable by leaving no internal surface for the projection to stick to. That is what individuation actually means in the depth psychology Jung was pointing toward. It is not the achievement of perfection, it is the achievement of internal wholeness, where the parts of you that were exiled in childhood, the anger you were told was unladylike, the ambition you were told was selfish, the perception you were told was paranoid, the desire you were told was inappropriate, the intelligence you were told was intimidating, all come home. And when they come home, they stop running your life from the basement. They begin to serve you from the throne. There is a specific, almost shocking experience that happens during shadow integration that no one warns you about. You begin to feel a strange, quiet compassion for the very people who hurt you. Not because what they did was acceptable, but because you finally see, with terrible clarity, how trapped they are inside their own unintegrated psyche. That compassion is not weakness. It is not forgiveness in the saccharine, performative sense. It is the cold, accurate compassion of someone who has climbed high enough to see the whole map. You no longer hate them, because hatred would require you to still be entangled with them. You simply observe. And in that observation, the final tether breaks. This is the moment the people who once held emotional power over you become small in your perception. Not because you have decreased their value, but because you have correctly calibrated it. They were never as large as your wound made them appear. They were ordinary people running ordinary psychological programs, and you happened to be the screen they were projecting onto. Once you remove yourself as the screen, the projection has nowhere to land, and they are left holding the contents of their own minds, which is the precise outcome they have spent their entire lives trying to avoid. There is one final architecture to all of this, the one that completes the transformation, the one that turns the Sophia Empath from a person who understands these dynamics intellectually into someone who embodies them effortlessly. And that architecture is what we will build next. The final stage of this entire arc is not a strategy, it is a state. The sovereign observer is not someone who performs detachment. They are someone for whom engagement and detachment are no longer intention, because the self that used to be desperate to be understood has been replaced by a self that is whole enough not to need that understanding from anyone. Imagine for a moment what your life looks like from inside this state. You walk into the same rooms you have always walked into. The same people are there. The same family member who has always made veiled comments. The same colleague who has always taken credit for your insights. The same old friend who never quite celebrates your wins. But something is different now, and they can feel it before you have said a word. You are warm without being available. You are present without being penetrable. You listen without absorbing. You respond without performing. You hold your own counsel. You allow long silences without rushing to fill them. You ask questions you already know the answer to, simply to see what they will reveal about themselves. You no longer flinch at provocation, because you no longer require their good opinion to feel real. And the strangest thing begins to happen. The people who used to drain you start to feel slightly afraid of you, even though you have not raised your voice or said a single sharp word. The people who used to manipulate you start to become subtly nervous in your presence, because they can sense, without being able to articulate it, that the old tools no longer work. The people who used to envy you secretly begin to expose themselves through their own behavior, because they cannot stop reacting to a stillness that gives them nothing to push against. This is what Carl Jung psychology means when it points toward individuation as the completion of the psychological project. You are no longer fighting the world. You are no longer defending against it. You are simply, finally yourself, and yourself has become large enough to contain everything that used to overwhelm it. The shadow projection that used to wound you now teaches you. The dark psychology that used to confuse you now reads to you like a familiar script. The hostility that used to make you doubt yourself now functions as a diagnostic instrument, telling you exactly where each person stands in their own integration. You have moved from being read by others to reading them, and that reversal is permanent. Notice that you have continued watching this far. Most people will not. Most people will encounter ideas like these and feel a quiet discomfort that drives them back toward content that confirms what they already believe. The fact that you are still here, still tracking, still recognizing yourself in these descriptions is itself information about who you are and what stage you have reached. This is not flattery. This is observation. The Sophia stage is not a popular destination. It is a small, quiet country, and the people who arrive there mostly arrive alone, which is exactly why the recognition you are experiencing right now matters. You have not been crazy. You have not been too much. You have not been broken. You have been becoming, and becoming is lonely until you find the language for what you are becoming into. That language is what you are receiving now, and it will change how you walk through the rest of this week, the rest of this year, and the rest of your life. But before we close, there is one final piece of the architecture to put in place, the piece that takes everything we have built and turns it into something you can actually live from, not just understand. And that piece begins with returning to the very first image we encountered together. Remember the mirror. We began with the idea that you have become a psychological mirror, and that the people around you are reacting to their own reflections in you. But here, at the end of the journey, that image transforms into something deeper than it appeared at the start. You are not just a mirror. A mirror is passive. A mirror only shows what is placed in front of it. What you have actually become is something Jung gestured toward but rarely named directly. You have become a clarifying presence. You do not simply reflect people. You reveal them to themselves, whether they want to be revealed or not, and that is a fundamentally different function. A mirror can be avoided. A clarifying presence cannot, because its effect operates beneath the level of conscious choice. The people in your life will continue to encounter you, and they will continue to be exposed by the encounter. And over time, the people whose lives cannot survive that exposure will quietly remove themselves from yours, while the people whose lives are enriched by it will quietly draw closer. This sorting happens without your effort. This is the deepest meaning of strategic detachment in the Jungian sense. You do not have to manage your relationships. Your integration manages them for you. Picture yourself 1 year from now, after everything in this conversation has had time to settle into your nervous system. You wake up in the morning and notice, almost as an afterthought, that you no longer rehearse old conversations in your head. The people who used to occupy your mental space, rent-free, have quietly vacated. You move through your day with a kind of internal spaciousness you have not felt since childhood. When someone tries to provoke you, you observe the provocation with mild curiosity, the way one might observe weather. When someone attempts to manipulate you, you see the move clearly, and you simply decline to participate, without explanation, without apology, without the old urge to make them understand why. You begin to attract a different quality of person, not because you sought them out, but because you have become legible only to those who can read what you actually are. The friendships you keep deepen. The ones that were always shallow fall away without drama. Your work changes. Your voice changes. The way people listen to you changes, because you have stopped speaking from the part of you that needed to be heard and started speaking from the part of you that simply knows. This is not a fantasy. This is the natural trajectory of any empath who completes the integration. The only question is whether you choose to walk that trajectory deliberately or stumble onto it accidentally over many more years of unnecessary suffering. You already know the answer. You already feel it. The threshold has already been crossed, and what you are doing now is simply catching up to a transformation that has already begun. If this work has reached you, and if you can feel that it has met you somewhere honest, then stay. This is the only place where the psychology of sovereignty, the architecture of individuation, the deep reading of human nature through Carl Jung, and the ancient mirror of empath awakening are explored without dilution. Subscribe, because the next stage of your integration deserves company that does not flinch from the depth you have earned. And whatever you do, do not stop now. The video on your screen is the next movement of this arc, and it was placed there for a reason. Trust me, you do not want to miss it. I will see you there. See what others miss. Know what others fear. Become who others can't.